Hey everybody, welcome to a history of video game consoles. My name is Max. I'm 5th gen, not Pokemon, as most of you probably remember from my panel. 5th gen isn't Pokemon, which is where, shut up, which is where I extensively, wait, there are microphones. Which is where I extensively talked about how 5th gen isn't Pokemon, except for like the guy with the mask. He just saw me do Settling for Catan instead, which is a panel where I talked about how Catan is awful. I didn't realize I had it till last night. So I was up till like 3. So let's just go into it. I'm going to start with the first generation of video game consoles. And I'm going to use my phone. So the first generation of consoles started in 1972. While there were technically video games before that, they were not really home consoles. So I'm going to ignore them for the purpose of this panel, because that would be too much work and research, and I don't care about those. So the first console generation started in 1972. This may or may not have been when America was great. We're not really sure, but it's a starting point. Defining attributes of this generation include the consoles having built-in games. So if you wanted the shiny new game, you had to get a shiny new console, which was honestly fine since everything was just a Pong clone. Everything was a Pong clone. The consoles, for some reason, could run on batteries. You know, in case you like went out into the woods with a generator and a TV, but there was only one outlet for the TV, but you really wanted to play Pong, you could still do that. It's probably just so then your parents didn't have to fiddle with all the outlets all the time. But let's be honest, it's the dumbest fucking idea. There was a big emphasis on multiplayer in this generation, specifically local multiplayer, because these games were awful if you didn't have a friend. So if you had one sibling, these were great, but if you were a true nuclear family, your life was still terrible, assuming you were the youngest child. There was also no color in most of these games, which means that it was objectively when America was great. We solved it. We did it. Thanks, Trump. Okay, so the first console out of the gate was the Magnavox Odyssey. It came out in 1972. Woo. It was developed by Ralph H. Baer, who also invented Simon, which, for those young people out there, Simon was a memory game where you hit lights. It was like a Bop It, but less sexual. Let's put it that way. So while I previously said that none of the games in this generation used cartridges, I was of course lying to you, because the Magnavox Odyssey used cartridges. The difference, of course, being you didn't like go out to the store and buy a new game for the Odyssey. It just came with cartridges with it. Because in the initial development of this, the games it had, because it had variations of Pong, and there were switches in the console that you were supposed to flip to get the specific game you wanted to play. So if you switched like flip A, F, and G or whatever, you got soccer. The thing is, nobody was technologically literate enough to understand that process. So instead, they just made little cartridges that you plugged into the console that would do it for you. Because let's be honest, even now, no one would really get how to do that. So that's the equivalent of a video game cartridge for the 1970s. The Odyssey retailed for $99, which sounds really affordable until you realize that was 1972 money. It actually cost $566 in today money to play Pong, which is fine because that's still cheaper than the launch price of the PS3. It sold a little over 1/3 units, which, while that doesn't sound particularly impressive for then, it really was, and helped demonstrate that people might actually want video games. Other interesting facts about the Odyssey: it came with this weird Dollar Tree party pack. The console had very limited capabilities. It was only able to display a white line and 3 white dots, and only one of the dots would be controlled by the computer. The others would be you and your friend. Or, I don't know, your other hand, if you're ambidextrous. So this meant that the games were pretty rudimentary, so they had to add a lot of mechanics to make them games, like playing cards, fake money, and poker chips. There would also be screen overlays to add atmosphere, because again, there are only 3 dots and a white line, so you can't really sell a haunted house with that. An example of just how player-dependent these games were to be fun was for Ski. You would have to time yourself playing it and keep track of the number of penalties you accrued while playing it. Meaning that if your friend said, hey, I scored 800 on ski, whatever that means, you just have to believe them because there's no high score mechanic. So it really, really enabled liars. And in classic American fashion, it was the first console to implement a light gun. The Odyssey was followed up by several more Odysseys between 1974 and 1977. These were also Pong clones. They were used to compete with other companies that were also producing Pong clones, because really the 70s were just Pong clones. Each succeeding console, though, had more functionality than the previous one, giving us more things that made us go, oh, it's a video game, with things like scoring, sound, difficulty levels, and not requiring dice, which is good because dice make everything worse. Next was the Nintendo Color TV, which was in color. I lied to you. Not everything was black and white in this generation. I like lying to you. That's the theme we're going on with here. I didn't lie about 5th gen. It's still not Pokemon, though. Don't worry. So this was easily the best-selling console of its generation. The Nintendo Color TV line sold over 3 million units, which is even more impressive when you factor in that it's a Japan-exclusive console. So even back then, Japan loved video games. Wow, have things changed. So these were also really affordable. In today money, the cheapest Nintendo Color TV was only $100, and they'd go up to about $600. So they were like, you could buy them, except in America because they were Japanese exclusive. Next, we had the Coleco Telestar. This is another Pong clone. In case you were curious if there was anything creative out of this generation, there wasn't. It was Pong clones. They released 14 of these with vaguely differing functionality or a lot of really weird gimmicks. I don't know how you use that. Like, what do you do with it? You do a drive-by? Yeah. That's the drive-by console. So Coleco collectively sold 1 million units with their 14 Pong clones. But they were relatively cheap, starting at $50 in back then money or $210 in today money. But because they created so many different Pong clones, along with the Odyssey creating so many different Pong clones, and Nintendo creating so many different Pong clones, we had a video game crash. Most of you are familiar with the 1983 one. This is, of course, the 1977 video game crash, wherein people stopped buying things because they were all Pong clones. I really have to emphasize that. And this actually almost bankrupted Coleco, but don't worry, they made it through to the second crash, which finished the job. So now we're on to Generation 2. This is the Atari generation. Called that because, let's be honest, of these 6, the only one you can name is the Atari. I've played 2 of these. I played the Vector X, the one with the built-in screen. That thing was weird. Yeah, don't applaud. So this is the only video game generation that doesn't actually have Nintendo in it. They I don't know, I guess they were busy making more color TVs or trading cards or something. They didn't care. What? Oh yeah, you're right. They were busy researching Italian stereotypes. They put a lot of work into Mario. So defining characteristics of this generation, it was the first generation to actually use cartridges because, let's be honest, the cartridges in the Odyssey don't count. The controllers were modular, meaning you could actually use a controller instead of having to use the console as a controller, which is how all the other consoles looked. So that's the controller and the console. And that's probably a war crime, but I'm not sure. So, yeah, you had controllers, they were modular. Sometimes they were hardwired to the console, sometimes they weren't, it really depended. And there were actual video games that weren't all Pong, which is easily the most exciting part. First out of the gate, we had the Fairchild Channel F, and as all first consoles out of the gate go, it failed miserably. It launched in 1976. It was the first console to use cartridges and have a CPU. Good job, Fairchild Channel F. You did so much, and we rewarded you with so little. But its legacy lives on. Its controllers look suspiciously like Wiimotes, or at least those flight sticks from the old flight simulator games you had to play. So, you know, it got that going for them at least. Next we have the Visions, because there were two. There was the Intellivision and the ColecoVision. The Intellivision, for some reason, had 16 button controllers, which is even more than now, even on a gaming mouse. So I don't know if they were ahead of the curve or way behind it, but let's put it this way, it was not fun. It also had a speech synthesizer, proving that, okay, good, there's my mouse, proving that even in the 70s, gimmicks were rife in video game consoles. Shockingly, the speech synthesizer was awful and was compatible with 4 whole games, which is 3 more than the one you got with your copy of Hey You Pikachu is compatible with. So Intellivision really beaten Nintendo in this category. ColecoVision was the closest thing to a Nintendo console. I don't remember why that's in this slide, but I'm saying it anyway. It was great at plagiarism, primarily because it had an add-on that let you play Atari 2600 games. So you didn't even need an Atari 2600, you just needed a ColecoVision and an add-on. To continue with the plagiarism, it was also compatible with Atari 2600 controllers. So when you didn't want to use that weird thing with the 12 buttons and the joystick and wanted to use something functional, you could do that. Shockingly though, most companies sell consoles at a loss, so probably didn't work out too well for them because they went bankrupt after this console. Next we have the Odyssey Squared, which had a full keyboard on it. Why? This is back when sometimes video game consoles were trying to be computers and computers were trying to be video game consoles, and no one was really good at either of them. So they say, hey, let's put a full QWERTY keyboard on it. It also had a voice synthesizer module, which I can totally pronounce, which did just as well as the Intellivisions, so it was awful. Its controllers are really bad. They're joysticks, but the Atari 2600 joystick is better. Just imagine like the Atari 2600 joystick as Lava Axe, and the Odyssey Squared joystick as Cinder Hatchet. We have like 2 people who play Magic. Let's do this. And technically, it was the precursor to the CDI, which tells you really all you need to know about the CDI. It's not going to do well. Next, we have the Atari. Woo, yeah, cool. The Atari 2600 is why it's called the Atari generation. It outsold all of its competition combined by a factor of 4, meaning of all the video game consoles to dominate each generation, this is the one that has done it most effectively if you exclude handhelds. So the Atari 2600, it wins. It was good, it could play video games, it did what it wanted to do, and it was a really forward-thinking console, so forward-thinking, in fact, that it was compatible with Sega Genesis controllers. You could plug in a Genesis controller, which for those of you who don't know, came out over 10 years after the Atari 2600, and it would work. This is also where we started seeing the invention of game genres outside of Pong. So the Atari had Pitfall, which was kind of the precursor to action-adventure platformers, and Adventure, which was not the precursor to action-adventure platformers, but instead RPGs. So this is really where you got new genres. You also had third-party developers, people going, wait a minute, I don't need to make a console, I can just make games for consoles. And that's what they did, and that clearly ended well for everybody. Atari also had AOL. I know you're thinking America Online. It's not. It's Atari Online. You could literally download games through a phone jack onto the Atari, proving even in Generation 2, there was just potential for downloadable content. No, right? Isn't that crazy? Like, everybody's just like, oh, well, like, the Xbox 360s when that started. No. Atari. So now we have Generation 3. This is where the slides get weird. So these are consoles you might know about, like the Atari 7800, which came and went throughout the duration of the Atari 2600. So even though it was better, they just didn't care. And the SG-1000, which was Sega's first attempt. And then we have consoles you actually know about. The Sega Master System, Sega's second attempt that was okay. and I found it at a flea market for $10. That was a good day. And the NES, yeah, thanks for the polite golf applause, which is really the only console in this generation that matters, the Famicom. And here are a lot of other consoles. They have names. That's a lot of consoles, isn't it? A few too many, would you agree?
Are any of them good?
Well, I mean, they're good enough to cause the video game crash, so sure. The video game crash it's when no one bought video games anymore. In North America, the market value of video games dropped from, in 1983, 3.2 billion to 100 million in 1985. So people abandoned video games, and there were a few reasons for this. First, there were too many consoles, as we just established. That's too many. So there were too many consoles, so no one knew what to buy. Everyone was competing for shelf space, and there's just, like, what do you do? Too many choices. Next, those third-party developers that we talked about being so great for the Atari 2600 were not so great for the video game console market. E.T. is, of course, the biggest offender, being just a flaming sack of garbage. However, there were other games that were really bad. For example, the Atari 2600 port of Pac-Man was notably awful. Because even though Pac-Man's a great game, the Atari 2600 version is almost unplayable compared to a good game like Asteroids. Also, there was a lot of competition from home computers. They were doing a good job of beating the shit out of video games at this time. So video games kind of almost died. Then they came back because Nintendo had this brilliant idea of quality controlling games and including a robot with their console. Woo, right? Rob, yeah, he's playable in Smash. That's his legacy. But yeah, Nintendo limited publishers to only making like 5 games a year, so there were pretty strict quality controls. So people suddenly knew, oh, maybe video games can be good, and someone's making decisions for me, so I don't have to make the decision anymore. So they bought Nintendos. It was great. And that quality control aspect really helped. Okay, these come in slow. Really helped actually develop video game franchises. So Gen 3 is where basically every franchise you know about came out, except of course Star Fox, which came out in Gen 2 for the Atari 2600. It's called Star Fox, but it's not in universe. So next we have the 4th generation of consoles. This generation started in 1987. So generally when you think 4th gen, you're probably thinking the Super Nintendo. Super Nintendo didn't come out in America until 1991. So this generation had a whole 4 years to get going and establish itself before it just got trounced.
It looks like a VCR.
Yeah, that's pretty common. Well, here's the thing. People were ashamed to own video games. So if they looked like a VCR, nobody would accuse you of being a filthy neckbeard. This was also the first generation where we started seeing a transition to optical discs instead of cartridges. Obviously, that's not the case for everything, but this is where it began. They also started using polygons because pixels are for people who use MS Paint. And as we all know, MS Paint is for losers. This is also where we saw an introduction of handhelds to the video game market because I don't count anything Tiger Electronics made or the Game & Watch franchise. Is it a video game if it's just a screen that lights up one of 5 spots? I don't think so. And I counted Pong. So that's where we're at. This is also where you kind of saw the end of computer-based consoles after the failure of the Commodore television. So this is because in the 3rd generation, you saw a lot of computers trying to be video game consoles and vice versa. And this is where you got a drift back away from that, which will be fixed, unfortunately. But for now, video game consoles are video game consoles. So here are the 2nd tier competitors. We have the TurboGrafx 16, first console out of the gate. It was developed by NEC and Hudson, meaning there was a brief period in time where Bomberman had his own console. Woo, yeah, right? If Bomberman's not in Smash, I'm gonna riot. I've been wanting him in since Brawl. He could kick a bomb, he could throw a bomb, he could kick more bombs. Yeah, he's got so many move options. So they released a lot of versions of the TurboGrafx 16 because back then that was a popular thing to do. And all of the iterations combined sold 10 million units. And while this wasn't their last console, that doesn't really matter. It was their last console that vaguely mattered. We also have the Neo Geo. Why? Are you rich? You know how much that thing sold for? Is $700. That's not today money, that's back then money.
What?
Yeah, the Neo Geo, yeah, right? So the Neo Geo was above and beyond the most graphically capable of all the consoles of this generation. And that was because it was made specifically to run high-quality ports of arcade games. Meaning, most of the games for the Neo Geo were arcade games. And because they were high quality and they put a lot of work into them, the games would often cost up to $300 each.
But the game itself?
Yeah, for a game, you would be paying up to $300. Shockingly, the Neo Geo did not win the console war.
Thank God.
Now, they did later release a more affordable version that was disc-based, but by the time that came out, the PS1 was already on the market. And why would you buy something that just runs arcade games when you could get a PS1? So next, we have the Odyssey 1 Squared, which I swear exists. This is the realest console ever made. It came with a full QWERTY keyboard on each controller, so you could play Phantasy Star Online with your friends. Not only did it have a full QWERTY keyboard, it had a full musical keyboard on the back. You could flip it over. And that is a GameCube controller. This is a high quality Photoshop. It's also got a Nintendo 64 DD. And yeah, that's kind of it. The problem is, of course, the Odyssey 1 Squared couldn't compete with the objectively superior CDI. So it failed. It was so bad, in fact, that its memory has been erased from history. And the only reason I know about it is because I found an entry on it from fanfiction.net. Next, we have Nintendo versus Sega, the final showdown, because this is the last time Sega mattered. Really the only time Sega mattered. So first, we have the Super Nintendo. It sold 49 million units. Good job. Compared to Sega's 33. Suck it. Actually, the Genesis was my first console. I shouldn't be saying that. The Nintendo's whole thing was being super family friendly, while the Sega Genesis was edgy and cool, because when I think edgy, I think Sonic the Hedgehog. Not Shadow, who's objectively way more edgier. This was really emphasized in the Mortal Kombat games, where Nintendo used sand and Sega used blood, which caused a whole ruckus, and then the ESRB had to be created. Though Night Trap did help. Night Trap was a great idea, and is for some reason coming out on the Switch market. So in case you want to play Night Trap, because you don't own a Sega CD, you can do that, but it's not that good. So I'm going to go over a couple errors Nintendo made here. Point 1, Sony designed the sound chip for the Super Nintendo. Point 2, they worked with Sony on a potential CD release for the Super Nintendo before bailing on them through a press release without telling Sony, following Sony doing a press release about them working with Nintendo. These events happened within 2 hours of each other. So shockingly, Sony was a little bitter. And we're going to see how that panned out. Right? I know. Versus the Genesis, which made its own CD expansion and a 32X expansion because they wanted to extend the life of their console and bleed consumers dry. Which, I mean, we all know they do. That's why they release a new version of Sonic every 10 minutes. This is also the first generation where we saw a lot of handhelds. Here we have the Atari Lynx, which sold less than 1 million units. The Turbo Express, which sold 1.5 million units. And the Sega Game Gear, which sold 11 million units. Good job, Sega Game Gear. These handhelds were great. They were full color. They were backlit. You could watch TV on them. And they had absolutely no battery life. And when it comes down to it, when you're playing a handheld, battery life is important. That's what Nintendo learned. So they did 2 things that the other companies didn't.
Rechargeable?
Huh?
Rechargeable battery?
No. Why would they do that? This is the 80s.
Pokemon!
That was the 90s. Get your shit together. So they did two things. One, they had battery life. And two, they made sure it didn't cost as much as a home console. And because of that, the Nintendo Game Boy outsold these three pieces of shit combined 8-1. 8-1.
No Tetris.
Yeah, no, it came packaged with Tetris, which, as promised, is from Russia with fun, much unlike Trump. The weird part about this, of course, is the Game Boy is inferior in literally every other way. The screen is black and white. There's no lighting. It just was cheap and didn't die in 2 hours. So, good job. Yeah, I know. And we're gonna see that pattern happen a lot, where Nintendo doesn't try but still wins. So next we have Generation 5. Wait, Generation 5. I put that in for you. Well, Gen 5 isn't Pokemon, that's what's important. This is when we saw the transition to 3D, not just gimmicky movie 3D like in Piranha 3D, or whatever the fuck Star Fox was trying to do with the turbo graphics, besides give me a seizure. Real 3D. This is when we saw this is when optical discs became the norm and cartridges were really going out, which Nintendo definitely got the memo for. But this is like the big thing here is we saw a radical shift in the console market. Nintendo got dethroned, Sega lost all faith with consumers, and Atari died. And Sony just kind of didn't trip over itself, and that's all you had to do in Gen 5, was not like objectively fuck up. So first we have the 3DO, the first fuck up out of the gate. This console was hyped so hard. It was Time Magazine's product of the year. And it only cost $700 on launch. And there was a reason for this. Now, credit to them, they had a really interesting market strategy with the 3DO, which was, while most companies sell consoles at a loss and then recoup that with licensing fees, that wasn't 3DO's style. Instead, they outsourced the production of the consoles. It's like Panasonic, Gold Star, Sanyo, they made 3DOs. So because of that, the 3DOs had to be sold at profit for those companies to make any money, which is why it cost $700. The benefit, though, for the 3DO company was then they collected substantially less in licensing fees for the console. It was like $3 versus $15 per game made. So they were trying to be really friendly for developers, which sort of worked out, but it's $700. No one's going to buy that shit. Except at least 1 million people, because that's how many copies of Gex sold for it. Though my copy, I only have the Incredible Machine, which is a pirate copy. Other revolutionary ideas of the 3DO include having only one controller port and forcing you to daisy chain controllers from then on. So second player is plugged into first player, who is then plugged into the console, because that was a really good idea. But basically, it had a lot of money behind it. It was hyped really large, really big, and then it just fell flat on its ass. So really, it's the prototype of Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. Next, we have the Atari Jaguar, which sold a whole 250,000 units, which is slightly more than the 64 bits it advertised it had. It was initially cartridge-based, but they decided to take some inspiration from a toilet and add a CD modifier to it. It pioneered a brilliant strategy of not releasing any games, which did wonders for it. It was later replicated by the Wii U, which also did so well. Now, the problem with the biggest issue the Jaguar had is that while it was graphically superior to a lot of its contemporaries, it had 5 CPUs, which is a lot. So what happened was most people would just program for one of the CPUs, because one of them was very similar to the Genesis and SNES one, which meant it just ran worse versions of Genesis and SNES games while being a better console. So nobody believed it was better because they just it's like, that just looks like a worse version of Street Fighter for the Genesis. Why would I buy this? And the answer is, you should, just nobody knows how to fucking program for it. Next we have Sega, who's really bad. Their initial entry to this generation was like Project Pelican or something, which devolved into the 32X, which looks kind of like a mushroom cloud, which is really reminiscent of how it exploded them. Because it came out after, so the 32X came out in America after the Saturn launched in Japan. So why would anybody buy 32X if the Saturn's coming out? A couple people did. It actually started well with sales, torpedoed, and then they were selling it at a quarter of the price within 6 months. Though the real problem here is, of course, the Saturn. Sega was trying to do a lot of interesting things, like a surprise launch announcement at the first E3, which, if you're curious how well launching a console through a surprise goes, it doesn't. Initially, it was going to come out in like November, and they're like, no, actually, you can buy it today. So they shipped it to a couple select retailers who would then sell the console, which pissed off all the retailers who weren't select retailers. So KB Toys, who I'm sure we all remember, did not carry Sega Saturns on launch and then refused to carry them afterwards because they were bitter, which was a good idea. The Saturn also had 2 discrete CPUs because when they saw a demo play of the PlayStation, they went, we need to be better than that, and slapdashed the console together. It used quadrilaterals instead of triangles for its polygons, which is fucking weird. Everyone uses triangles and like, nah, quadrilaterals. So these 2 things made it really hard to program for. So no one really wanted to program for it. It also didn't have a Sonic title, and it launched at $399, which we will quickly learn is more than you want to launch for. Next we had the Nintendo 64. This was the last time Nintendo had the most powerful console of its generation. Sorry, yeah, I know. Really, well, unless you count Gen 9, since nothing's out for that yet except the Switch. Yeah, this was actually better than everything else, partially because it came out after everything else. But that didn't really matter because they used cartridges, which had severely limited storage space, because Nintendo likes to have absolute control over everything, including the format everything comes out with. So companies didn't really want to deal with cartridges because it was more expensive on their end. On the bright side, there were faster load times, but also higher manufacturing costs. Really, it's just, don't use cartridges. Why are you still using cartridges, Nintendo? You're just using SD cards now.
Hey, those cartridges still work today.
Huh?
Those cartridges still work
Yeah, I know, but it doesn't matter. They taste delicious. The cartridges do. Why do you eat them? You're not a cat. And cats don't eat them either. Are you like some really intricate cosplay of someone who literally eats video game consoles? How's that an O? That's like the lowest effort. Okay. So basically why Nintendo survived this generation was that a lot of really good first-party titles, it made up for the fact that no one else wanted to make games for them because they wouldn't transition to optical discs. The controller was also very ergonomically designed. It was great if you had 3 hands. But, and this can be said about Nintendo and nothing else in this generation, it's still getting games to this day. With hit titles like Waluigi's Taco Stand, which you can actually buy on Etsy. Where else does he sell it? You know him.
eBay.
eBay. You can also buy it on eBay. It's a beautiful game for beautiful people. Probably not. Honestly, I wanted Waluigi's Taco Stand to be a Lemonade Tycoon port, but this is fine. It's Mario 64 hack. Okay, and finally, we have the Sony PlayStation. Really? You guys suck. Outsold the combined competition of the generation 2-1. Good job. Yeah, no, those suck. I like internal memory. Thank you very much. So, here's what Sony did right. The games were on CDs, as was the format standard of the generation. The hardware was not intricate.
And they stole Final Fantasy.
Yeah, but that's because of these things.
They just didn't fuck up.
Yeah, they didn't fuck up. That's all they did was not fuck up. They used CDs like Nintendo should have. The hardware was not intricate like Sega's. It never retailed for $700 like the 3DO. That is all they had to do, and it worked. They reached out to third parties and went, hey, you don't have to pay for the goddamn cartridges anymore. You can just do a CD. Those are cheap. And the third parties are like, that's reasonable. Also, you're not going to like tell us what to do. Okay, sure, why not? And it worked. A lot of why this exists is because Sony was super bitter. Like they had a lot of board meetings, and basically the pitch for whoever was in charge of the game division at this time, whose name I can't remember, but it's still, I don't care anymore. His whole pitch was, Nintendo fucked us over, let's make video game consoles. And it worked. They were bitter, and now they run the market. And of course, there was the Dreamcast. What's my gen again? What's my gen again? That's about the time consumers walked away from me. I couldn't write anymore. It didn't really work out. I wanted to say nobody liked me since Gen 3, but that's not true. Generation 6. No, this is shitty fucking generation. So, this is consoles for the 20th century. I'm sorry your childhood was bad. This is where childhood was good. We shit together. Kirby and the Crystal Shards are nothing.
Hey, we finally got Halo.
I don't care. Okay, so consoles for the 20th century. This is the first generation that really focused on cross-platform titles, especially titles that were between the platforms themselves and computers, because computer gaming is starting to merge into console gaming a little more again, where in the 90s it was mostly shit like Age of Empires or Roller Coaster Tycoon. Thank you. I have 10 minutes. This is also America's triumphant return to the console market with the Xbox. That is because we are, of course, excluding Magnavox, who is clearly still going strong at this point, with whatever Odyssey they're on now. This is also where online multiplayer actually started working, and consoles began serving general home entertainment needs in addition to being consoles. Before this, they could play CDs sometimes, and that's kind of it. And also, we got 2 joysticks, so yeah, 2 joysticks for the new, who cares? We had online gaming, I said that already. Consoles had broadband adapters, or like the Xbox is just built into the console. This is where a lot of like new game franchises showed up, and we had some really interesting best-selling games as gamers aged. So we saw more like Grand Theft Auto and Halo instead of Mario World. And while these may have been the best-selling games, they're of course not the best game. Objectively the best game of any console generation.
Is that your story?
Huh? Yeah, why wouldn't it be? It's also real, I didn't have to Photoshop this. So who won? It was Sony. They outsold everything combined almost 3-1 with 150 million PS2 sales in a ridiculously long lifespan. This is primarily in part because Sony tied their fate to DVD. People were kind of sick of VHSs, and DVDs didn't need to rewind. People were starting to adopt over DVDs. And when it comes down to it, if you have to buy your kids a video game console, but you want a DVD player, why not get a PS2?
That's exactly what my mom did.
Yeah, right? That's why my mom was like, hey, are you sure you don't want a PS2 for your birthday? I'm like, no, I want a GameCube. And then I got a PS2 also anyway for like no reason. Just want a DVD player. Worked out. You gotta leverage them. That's what parents are for. So that's really what sold the PS2 was the PS2 tied itself to DVDs. So people would buy a PS2 because it played DVDs, which spurred adoption of DVDs as a video format, which caused more people to switch to DVDs, which caused more people to buy PS2s, and you had this vicious cycle where people just kept fucking buying PS2s.
We fell for it.
Yeah, we did. Xbox and GameCube sold about 25 million units each, and the Dreamcast sold about 10, which is honestly pretty good given it died a year after it released because the Dreamcast came out and everyone was like, well, I could wait a year and buy a PS2. And they did. Also, here's how the handheld market worked out. Nintendo won. Who would have fucking thought? The Tapwave Zodiac tried to be a like Palm Pilot thing, and who wants that? They could just buy a Palm Pilot. And the N-Gage was also a phone, which was kind of cool, except you had to call people like this, holding it. And if you wanted to change games, you had to remove the battery and put the game in. They fixed that in later iterations, but at this point it was too late. It was already still the N-Gage. This brings us to the 7th generation of consoles. This is basically a discount console of the generation. It's the Game Wave.
I've seen this, yeah.
Why?
Because my brother's a video game nerd.
No, that's, okay, the Game Wave is a DVD player that has some built-in piles of shit. Which is basically everything you got this generation that wasn't Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft. The off-brand garbage. This is really when the market started to solidify into 3 different console companies versus earlier where it's everybody fighting all the time. This console generation was basically, hey, look, better graphics. Online play became the standard versus the previous generation where it's kind of like, oh, I can do that, but why? And online play started to spur more of an adaptation to online play instead of local multiplayer. And this is when widespread downloadable games through official markets became a thing, because that already wasn't a thing with Atari or Sega Channel or any of those other failed attempts. The Nintendo 64 DD, whatever. So here we have Microsoft and Sony. Neither really won. They both entered this market trying to do the same thing Sony did last time, which was leverage their success on media formats. Xbox did the HD DVD, which died a miserable death. And Sony did the Blu-ray. The difference here, of course, was nobody really wanted Blu-ray. So they just sold a $600 console that played Blu-rays. And nobody was willing to do that. The difference here was when the PS2 came out, DVD players cost like $200 or $300, so why not buy the PS2? Well, here, Blu-ray players cost slightly less, but we're also Blu-ray players, so no one cared. These consoles also started to drift in like the same direction where they're appealing to hardcore adult gamers. And a lot of the games weren't console exclusive, they were between the two. So it was kind of a taste of who liked it more. While both of these consoles both sold about 80 million units, they had regional variations. Like nobody in Japan bought a 360 because Japan doesn't trust consoles made by American companies. No, if you exclude Japan, the Xbox 360 outsold the PS3 by like 10 million units. Yeah. But once you factor in Japan, that is not the case. And then I guess we have the technical winner by more sales, which is the Wii or the V. Instead of doing the same thing that Microsoft and Sony were doing, Nintendo instead tried to appeal to casual and new gamers, which worked out in the short run. The Wii outsold those consoles pretty effectively early on, but in the end actually sold 1 million units to their 80 million. So while they won early, in the end, there was no real clear winner this generation. Nintendo just kind of shoehorned themselves into a different path. But, it was fun. It was more based on like playing with friends and a more immersive interaction experience with the games instead of sitting down with the controller. It's like, oh, Wii! Yay, bowling! I honestly wonder if it wouldn't have outsold these consoles if it weren't for retirement homes. Next we have handhelds. Why? This is where Sony has again fucked up. The PSP tried to leverage a new media format because that worked so well the last few times with UMDs. Well, let's be honest, who wants to watch a movie on a UMD on that tiny screen? Nobody. Just buy a portable DVD player. So again, the PSP was better than the DS. The graphics were better. The games were longer. All of that stuff. But these aren't things that matter in handhelds, as everybody should have learned by now. So Nintendo just made casual games and didn't focus on graphics, and they won. They outsold the PSP 2-1.
Black and white.
Huh?
They had Pokemon Black
Get the
and white.
fuck out. Gen 8, I guess we're kind of there. If you're curious who won, it was the PS4. by a lot. This is the closest thing we've gotten to market dominance since Gen 6. Because honestly, the One might have sold more consoles at this point, not than the PS4, but in general. But Microsoft is too afraid to admit their sales figures. But their goal was to sell 200 million units. So give them a few more decades and they'll be halfway there. Now, the interesting thing here is that, as I said in the last generation, most of the PS3 and the 360 sold 80 million and the Wii sold 100 million. But here, the best selling is only 80, and the others combined are less than half of that. I couldn't even find sales figures for the Ouya. But also, does the Ouya matter?
1 million.
See, I saw that, but I don't believe it. Because even the Ouya boards wouldn't say it was 1 million, and these people are so fucking pretentious. Like you know how they're the people who's like gamers or a master race? They're like that, but Ouya players are better than people who play real consoles. So there's the handheld market. Sony sucked at that. But really, when it came down to it, what sold more than these dedicated handheld consoles? It is, of course, phones. Phone games, which means the true winner of the handheld race in Gen 8 was Steve Jobs. With that turtleneck. Okay, now we have Gen 9. Gen 9 doesn't really exist yet. They're kind of still releasing variations of their existing consoles, which honestly is fine. I have a big issue with that. I think it makes sense, but there are murmurs for new consoles, which sucks, because I kind of want them to just die.
It just feels
Where's
like
my mouth?
it's already around two.
Yeah, that was TurboGrafx 16.
I'm just hoping we get black 3 and white 3.
Kill yourself.
I like Diamond and Pearl.
Huh?
Black's right.
I actually barely played 4. Okay, so if we're going to follow the existing naming conventions, we can assume that the PlayStation's next console will be the PlayStation 5, and Microsoft's will be the Xbox 72. That's how it works out. But really, all that matters in this generation currently is what is the future of Nintendo, and we're really not sure yet. So initially, when I made this panel, I had 3 scenarios for the Switch. The third scenario is not going to be the case at this point, which is the Switch kind of goes the way of the Dreamcast, where it's an objectively interesting and good console, but it just kind of dies away because no one really had faith in the company anymore. That is not the case. Am I out of time? 0, cool. Okay. So I'm going to just start cleaning up. The alternatives there were that either